Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director. We just learned that the great Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI has passed away. The 265th pontiff of the Catholic Church lived for almost a century. And so today on this special bonus episode, I'm joined with Bishop Barron to discuss his life, his enduring impact, and his key ideas and contributions. Bishop, it's kind of a somber day, but also a joyous one in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously it's a sad day. He was a great man and one of the most consequential players in the church, really, of the last 100 years, I would say. But, for people of a spiritual vision in the Christian faith, it's a day of joy as he finds the friendship with the Lord that he always longed for. So, it's a sad day, as you say, somber, but at the same time, we rejoice in his union with the Lord.
Joseph Ratzinger, as he was known before becoming Pope, was born in 1927. So this man lived almost 100 years. The number of events that he witnessed and was a part of, both within the church and in the wider world, is enormous. We could spend hours talking about his whole biography, but can you give us a basic arc of the life of Ratzinger Benedict?
I'll see if I can. There's so much to say, but just maybe a few highlights. As you say, born in 1927, he's from the southern part of Germany, from Bavaria, which is a deeply Catholic culture, and he was formed very much by that. His father was a fierce anti-Nazi, and young Joseph comes of age during those Hitler years, and he's a teenager at the end of the war, and for a brief time is in the Hitler Youth, but just the way that any young man was drawn into that. At the very end of the war, he was actually involved in defending the fatherland, but he was just a kid at the time. Joins the seminary, becomes a priest, and does pastoral work for a very short time, but everyone knew he was destined for an academic career because his brilliance in that field was evident early on. He's kind of a phenomenon in a way, because as a very young man, he gets these important positions in German universities in Bonn and Munster, I think. And then he comes to the attention of Cardinal Frings, who was the Archbishop of Cologne. And this was the time to be a theologian, because this was when Vatican II was just being talked about and then getting underway. And the leading bishops wanted periti, that's the Latin for theological experts, to bring with them. And so Frings has the brilliant idea to bring along this startlingly bright young theologian. So to Rome in 1962 comes Joseph Ratzinger. He's there for all the sessions of the council. Despite his youth, he plays an outsized role at Vatican II, helping to write some of the major documents in dialogue with all the major players, helping to explain the council to those around him. I have argued for a long time it's the central event of his life. He's a man of the Second Vatican Council, a player at it. During the council, if you want to put it this way, a liberal, because he was for the reforms of the council, against those forces that were resisting the conciliar reforms. But then, of course, very quickly after the council, he becomes an equally vehement critic of a Catholic progressivism that he saw as going beyond the conciliar texts, as claiming a magisterium for itself, of threatening the integrity of the Catholic tradition. And so he becomes an outspoken opponent of that. So by 1975, the liberals become a conservative, even though he himself hasn't changed his thinking at all. And he said that at one point. I find it very credible, having read him a lot over the years. He didn't change, but he remained steadfast against these two ways of resisting Vatican II, let's say. And I think that's the key now to understanding him. He is a man of the council who wants to defend it against its conservative and its liberal critics. Now, he finds a very like-minded friend in Karl Wojtyła. He would have known him at Vatican II, because Wojtyła was the Archbishop of Krakow, so he was there as a father of the council, Ratzinger as a peritus. They would have known each other. But they really came to know each other, they say, during the conclaves of 1978, the year of the three popes. So they were both cardinals by that time. Ratzinger had been made Archbishop of Munich, and then was quickly named a cardinal by Paul VI. So he and Wojtyła are together at those conclaves. And I think Wojtyła realized, this man's a kindred spirit to me. So then when Wojtyła becomes John Paul II, he taps Ratzinger as his head of doctrine. So then for about 25 years, Cardinal Ratzinger became very well known as the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I think the best way to read his work during those years is what I just said. He was a defender of the right interpretation of Vatican II and holding off its critics on both left and right. Elected Pope at the death of John Paul II in 2005, even though he was pretty old, he was 78 in 2005. And I remember that very well, that a lot of people thought, well, sure, he's great, but he's just too old to be Pope. He gives a sermon at the Mass preparing for the conclave. And he used that famous phrase, the dictatorship of relativism. We'll come back to that. It's one of the key themes of his life and thought, I think. But the cardinals, I think, realized pretty quickly, look, I know he's 78, but this is the man that can carry on the legacy of John Paul II. So he's elected Pope in 2005, takes the name Benedict XVI, and then reigns for 8 years. So not a short papacy. It was kind of a standard length papacy. And then, of course, famously, 2013, he resigns the papacy, the first one to do it in, what was it, Brandon, 700 years or something. I remember those days very well. I was doing commentary for NBC News at the time, and there was so much interest in the fact of his resignation and the election of his successor. And then the last, 10 years or so, he's living in kind of retreat and isolation in the Vatican gardens. So that's, if you want, the arc of a rather extraordinary life that's just come to an end.
Let's go back to those years in the early to mid 60s, which marked the most defining and important time, I think, in Ratzinger's life and in the life of the church. The Second Vatican Council, arguably the most important event in the last 100 years in the church. You mentioned that he was attending the council as an expert, a sort of theological consultant. I marvel at the fact that he shows up as I think a 35-year-old, maybe 36 years old. I'm 36. Thinking like someone my age going to all these, the brightest theologians in the world and helping to author the documents, giving consultation. It's remarkable. But tell us a little bit more about his influence on the council. How does the conciliar documents bear his fingerprints? And then after the council, how did the council impact him? How did he impact the council? How did the council impact him?
Well, to say, first of all, he was a kind of wunderkind, to use that wonderful German word. He's kind of this wonder child. Like, how did this happen? When I was 35, I got my doctorate when I was about 32. I just started teaching at Mundelein. And I would have felt completely incapable of operating at that level of theological, sophistication. But they just recognized his gifts very early on. Now, what did he bring? See, Ratzinger was very much a theologian of the ressourcement movement, so-called. When he was going to school, and most people of the Vatican II generation, they would have been formed in the standard neo-scholasticism of the time. Now, we don't have time to get into all those details, but a kind of, call it rationalistic revival of Thomism. Think of a figure like Garrigou-Lagrange, would have been a typical theologian of that time and school. A number of figures, Omer Lubach comes to mind, Danielu comes to mind, Urs von Balthasar comes to mind, resisted neo-scholasticism, and they called for less of a rationalism and more of a return to the sources. So the French call this the aux sources movement sometimes, back to the sources, namely the Bible and the Church Fathers. And there are a lot of reasons for that move, but one was that they just found that theology, I think, more spiritually engaging and more appealing to the imagination. They also thought it would be a better vehicle for the dialogue with the modern world. And there's much more we could say about it, but the young Ratzinger, it's fair to say, becomes a devotee of that school. He studies St. Bonaventure, and that's interesting in itself because if Thomas Aquinas was the dominant figure of the time, it's interesting that this young wunderkind theologian says, I'm not going to study Aquinas, I'm going to study his counterpart, the Franciscan Bonaventure, who represents a very different theological style and school, namely the Franciscan, and behind that, the Augustinian. So you want the two figures that really impact the young Ratzinger, I'd say Bonaventure, and behind him, Augustine. And he said many times, Augustine, he's my master. He's the one, if I were on a desert island, I'd bring the Bible and I'd bring the confessions. That Augustine was his great teacher. I think that's, Brandon, what he brought to Vatican II was a keen sense of the ressourcement, which they saw as not just a sort of retrieval of old stuff. They saw it as a means by which the church could enter into more creative dialogue with the contemporary society. More to it, they saw it as a more effective vehicle for a conversation with Protestantism, because they felt that the church had gotten kind of stuck in the 16th century debates. And then the Catholic Church, embracing a neo-Thomism that was fiercely anti-Protestant. Why not, some of them suggested, let's go back to a time before the 16th century, before the Protestant Catholic split. And can we find some common ground in the Bible and the Fathers? So that, I think, was another inspiration for the ressourcement move. But that's, I think, what he brought to the council. Now, what did the council bring to him? I think it just shaped him in almost every way. I think it became the defining event of his life, that defending it and propagating it became his central preoccupation. The church in dialogue with the modern world. Now, he saw Catholic progressivism as overstating that to some degree, doing it awkwardly, caving in too much to the world. So he's not naive about that. But he never abandoned the great elan of Vatican II. I remember, I don't know if it was a video or if I read it in an interview. He was there for the great, it's called the Discorso della Luna, the discourse under the moon. It's when John the 23rd, the opening of Vatican II, that night of the opening, he appears at the window and there's this huge candlelight procession going on and there's a full moon shining. And you find it on YouTube. It's very moving because he had this wonderful, resonant, kind of deep voice. And he's addressing the crowds and he's talking about the moon is looking down upon this great spectacle. Well, Ratzinger said he was there for that. He was somewhere in that crowd. And he still remains enchanted by that moment, when John the 23rd was kind of celebrating the importance of the council. So I think that's it. Maybe something worth mentioning too, he might be, Brandon, the last major player of Vatican II to be alive. He came as a very young man. So think the bishops, I think, who were at Vatican II, maybe there are some exceptions, but they're almost all gone. And then even the Pariti, I think most of them. Hans Kung, who would have younger than Ratzinger, he's gone. In a way, his death, it's the ringing down of the curtain on Vatican II in some ways. There won't be anybody with a living memory of it.
This long dual papacy of John Paul II and Benedict XVI was noted for its expansive outward turn toward the world. So you have John Paul II traveling to more countries than any previous pope. He was the great evangelist. He proposed the gospel to the wider world. But then you have Benedict XVI, who was a noted public intellectual in a way that many past popes hadn't been. In fact, you could describe him as one of the theological and intellectual giants of the last 100 years. And again, not just within the church, but on the broader intellectual landscape. For example, he was an interlocutor with many other renowned intellectuals, such as Jürgen Habermas. He instituted the Courtyard of the Gentiles project, which was meant to be a sophisticated outreach to the realm of arts and media, etc. How would you describe Benedict XVI's tone for the church's engagement with the wider world, and what lessons can we draw from it today?
He was very much in the patristic spirit, and the fathers gave us that sense of the semina verbi, right? The seeds of the word. So if we hold that Jesus is the Logos, well, then anything that's logical is related to him. There's if you want, the central teaching of his famous Regensburg speech that was so controversial because of his citation of a medieval critic of Islam. But the central point of that talk is really interesting. If Jesus is not just one figure among many, but he's the incarnation of the very mind of God, then anything logical, whether it's in the sciences or it's in philosophy or it's in cultural forms, well, that's a cousin of Christianity. That's a relative of Christianity. And if Jesus is the Word, well, then there are semina verbi, there are seeds of the Word all over the place. And so the job of the church is to find those and to engage those and maybe water those and see if they grow. I think that was the key to his engagement. Now, see, notice something interesting there, is it begins Christologically. It's not a surrender to the world. And if I might, in his spirit, offer a critique of Catholic liberalism, that could be the tendency to surrender the church too much in the enthusiasm to embrace the world, that we lose Catholic particularity. Well, see, Ratzinger operated out of that wonderful paradox that no, it's actually the more authentically Christian you are, the better you are at engaging in dialogue with the wider culture. And if you say, no, I'm going to leave my Christianity behind so I can enter into dialogue, it'll end up being a dysfunctional dialogue. And I think that's how we would have critiqued Catholic progressivism. I think that's the contribution, Brandon, that he made. And that's an important one. It's patristic, it's very ancient, but it's very important for our time too.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into that particular idea and some of his other ideas. But before we do, I wanted to ask you about any personal memories or encounters you had with him. I know you met him maybe once, twice, and you've heard him many times speak. What are your personal memories of Benedict XVI?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know him. I met him precisely once. I was over in Rome. It was right after he was elected Pope. It was 2006 maybe. And we were having an event in Chicago called 24 Hours of Grace, where we were offering confession for 24 hours. So I was in Rome for something else. I forget what it was. And I had procured these purple stoles that the priests were going to wear during this. And somehow I got in the prima fila, they call it, the first row at the audience. And the Pope came by, and it's noisy, and I shouted something like, "Hi, I'm Father Barron from Chicago, and could you bless these stoles?" And so then he solemnly blessed them, and we have a photo of that. But that's the one time I met Joseph Ratzinger. But I did see him a lot when I was in Rome in 2007. So I was there as a scholar in residence at the North American College. And on Wednesdays, you know, the Pope typically has an audience. During the bad weather, it's inside. In nicer weather, it's out on the square. So I was there during nicer months. And I made a point of going to practically all of those audience talks. The ones I heard were on the great theologians. They were on some of the fathers, then the medieval doctors. And so here's this figure who himself was like a church father, talking about these figures. And, you know, his command of languages, his erudition, his articulate manner of thinking, all that was on display. But what really struck me was his love for the Lord. I mean, he was someone who was in a deep friendship with Christ. And you saw it in his manner of being and his gesture and his tone of voice. Those are enduring memories for me. To be present, it was sort of like being there when John Chrysostom was giving a sermon, or when Augustine or Ambrose was speaking. That's how it felt to me. And I still remember those with great fondness and great spiritual profit.
Well, I'd like to spend the rest of our discussion here exploring some of Benedict's key ideas and contributions. Now, just as it's impossible to summarize his whole life in just a couple minutes, it's impossible to sum up his intellectual contributions. He's written 65 plus books, 3 encyclicals, countless speeches, letters, homilies. So this is necessarily a very truncated summary, but I think that these 5 lessons represent some of his lasting legacy. So the first one, true reform versus false reform in the church. Reform was a major buzzword throughout his life, especially before, during, and immediately after the Second Vatican Council. But he went to great lengths to ensure that reform was properly oriented. And in particular, he introduced these 2 phrases, the hermeneutic of continuity versus the hermeneutic of rupture. I know those are long technical phrases, but how did Pope Benedict understand reform, and why did he think it was needed in the 20th century church?
Yeah, and you mentioned when you say true and false reform, you're referring to Yves Congar, who was maybe the most important theological figure at Vatican II. His famous text, Vraie et fausse réforme dans l'Église. Ratzinger would have read that with great interest, and I think would have subscribed to it. And you put your finger on it, Brandon, with the different hermeneutics. He didn't like the progressive or liberal interpretation that saw Vatican II as a rupture. And I'll say this, when I was a little kid going to Catholic grade school in the years after Vatican II, and that was very much the way it was presented to us. Vatican II was a revolution. There was darkness before, then there was this great burst of light in 1965, and then we've been living in the luminosity of Vatican II since then. it was presented very much as a revolution, not an evolution. Where he would have adopted, another hero of his was John Henry Newman. It might have been Ratzinger that led me to Newman, who became a hero to me. But, Newman, who famously talks about the development of doctrine, yes, indeed, but doctrine develops in an evolving way. It doesn't lose contact with its past, doesn't become something else. It unfolds its own true meaning and integrity. So I think Ratzinger would have seen that's what's happening at Vatican II. Now, was it needed? Sure. Look at the liturgical reforms. Ratzinger would have been very much a devotee of Romano Guardini and of a liturgical movement. These are the people going back now to the 10s and 20s and 30s in Germany and Europe and in our country, who are saying, look, the liturgy has become so ossified that most Catholics have no connection to it. They don't know what's going on. We want full, conscious, and active participation, all of those things. Ratzinger would have been very much behind that and would have supported, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the great statement of Vatican II on liturgy. He would have subscribed to another hero of his, Urs von Balthasar, who said the church has been crouching behind its medieval walls too long. It's time to raise the bastions and to get the church out into the world. He would have subscribed very strongly to that. So read the great texts, many which he helped to write. Lumen Gentium, a new way of thinking about the church, or it's called an evolution in our understanding of the church, not starting so much top down, but beginning with the people of God and the universal call to holiness. And he would have subscribed to all that. So I think that's how he saw himself in relation to Vatican II.
Let's talk about a second lesson, which is liturgical renewal. You mentioned the name Romano Guardini, who famously wrote a book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. Joseph Ratzinger later wrote a subsequent book with that same title and in the same vein. Guardini was one of the figureheads of this 20th century liturgical movement. As you say, Ratzinger was attracted to that. How did he specifically contribute to the liturgical renewal of recent decades?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and this is where things get intriguing because, as I say, the young Ratzinger, following Guardini and many others, Karl Adam in Germany, think of people like Virgil Michael over here, would have, seen the need for this great reform of the liturgy. Now, fast forward to when Joseph Ratzinger writes his own book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. By that time, the reform of the council had given rise, he thought, to some real distortions of the liturgy. That the liturgy had become too much focused on us. It was anthropocentric rather than Christocentric. It had become, too much of a this-worldly celebration of the community rather than a participation in the mystery of redemption, etc. And so by that time, he's a critic, more conservative critic, let's say, of what had happened with the liturgy after the council. Again, it's that idea of Ratzinger at the council, the liberal, right, calling for liturgical reform, but then decades later, Ratzinger, the conservative, was saying, well, wait a minute, but what happened to the liturgy was not really what Vatican II had in mind. So I think he contributes at both stages of his career, if you want. He contributes as a liberal at the council, and he contributes as a conservative critic later in his career. And I think both are very important moments. And look at our dialogue today, Brandon. There are still people today, liturgically, who say, look, the whole Vatican II thing, that was a big mistake. Let's go back to the way it was. Or people on the progressive left, like, let's keep changing the liturgy until it becomes unrecognizable. Both Ratzingers, or let's say Ratzinger looking both ways, the 60s and the 90s, are both needed. They're both needed today.
A third major lesson we can take away from the life and teachings of Benedict is the importance of the Bible for theology. Mm-hmm. Now, Ratzinger Benedict wasn't a biblical scholar per se in the terms we would use today, but he was definitely a biblical theologian, meaning one who incorporates and uses Scripture heavily throughout his theologizing. He also came of age in a period where the historical critical method was in vogue, and a lot of his career was with engagement with that theory. What did Benedict teach about the Bible and its role in theology?
It's a very interesting thing, and again, the length of his life and his career contribute to the complexity of the thing. I mentioned he's a ressourcement theologian. One of the problems that a lot of the people that taught him had with neo-scholasticism was its lack of biblical reference. They thought it was too much of a deductively rationalistic philosophical approach to religion. And so the recovery of the Bible becomes key for them. Now, who had that in their bones but the church fathers? So you can't read Augustine. Augustine, a philosophically brilliant figure, obviously, but he's a biblical theologian. Read someone like Origen, he's animated at every turn by the Bible. The great preachers like Ambrose and Chrysostom, and then Jerome, who's the great biblical figure. The fathers were immersed in the Bible. So that's an opening move that Ratzinger makes, to say that we need a ressourcement that brings us back to the Bible. Then to your second point, fast forward from the Council, the 60s, to 1988. And it's a text that I think is one of the most important that Ratzinger wrote. And it was at a conference sponsored by Richard John Neuhaus in New York. At the time, Neuhaus was still a Lutheran. He was about to become a Roman Catholic. But it was a conference on the Bible. And some of the leading figures, Raymond E. Brown himself was there. So some of the leading figures in Catholic biblical scholarship, most of whom operated out of the historical critical method. And Ratzinger gives this kind of programmatic speech, not rejecting historical criticism, but of saying it needs to be complemented and supplemented in all sorts of ways. And what he was suggesting was a more patristic way of doing it. That speech had a huge impact on a lot of us. I'll include myself there. 88, where was I? I was 2 years ordained to the priesthood at that point. I would have been formed almost entirely in an historical critical approach to the Bible. I don't know when I first read Ratzinger's speech. It wasn't in 1988, but it led me, I'll confess, to say, yeah, we need to think about this thing differently. Most of the work I've done with the Bible has been very much animated by this Ratzingerian ressourcement move.
Well, fourth major lesson from the life and teaching of Benedict XVI was his synthesis of faith and reason. Especially in light of an unbelieving world, he felt it was important, following the moves of John Paul II, to emphasize not just the compatibility, but the mutually enhancing nature of both faith and reason. You mentioned earlier his famous Regensburg address, maybe the climax of this point. Again, controversial because of some offhand remarks about Islam, but it was fundamentally about the need to see reason as a common ground from which to address differences of opinions, whether ethical, theological, moral. What was he arguing there in the Regensburg address, and why is that still important today?
Yeah, it's super important. And I made the point earlier about Christ the Logos, and therefore all of logic is related to him. But there's another point he made there that's interesting. Namely, the importance of an intellectual approach over a voluntaristic approach. So voluntarism, from voluntas in Latin, meaning will. When you have a will-centered approach, the focus comes to be upon power. Voluntarism often begins as a theological movement. We're so impressed by God's transcendence and God's sovereignty. God can do whatever God wants. And so the voluntas Dei, the will of God, becomes the most important. Well, that will translate itself very often into a sort of voluntarism at the human level, where politically speaking, culturally speaking, speaking both individually and collectively, it's the will that matters. Well, see, what Ratzinger saw, and he's dead right about this, I've always been a sharp critic of voluntarism because it leads almost ineluctably to violence, is we don't find a common ground that we can talk and think about. We have two opposing wills. We have my will and your will, and there's no way to really adjudicate the dispute. I think there's a straight line from voluntarism to someone like Nietzsche and to Foucault in our time, that those are voluntaristic instincts. Ratzinger said, a logos-centered religion is one that leads toward dialogue rather than toward violence. Dialogue, there's logos again, right? If Christ is the logos, then anything logical is related to him. Well, that means I can find common ground with another philosophy, with another science, with another cultural perspective, if we can find what's logical in our two perspectives. That's what he was arguing in the Regensburg Address, and it remains of crucial significance, I think, in our conversation today.
Well, let's turn to the fifth and final lesson from Pope Benedict XVI. I think it's maybe his most defining mark. It's also one of the 8 principles of Word on Fire. We've adopted it as our own, and that's Christocentrism. Christocentrism. I think you've used that phrase a couple of times.
Yeah.
I think back to the very first paragraph in Benedict's encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, in which he has what's maybe his most famous one-liner, his most famous quote. He says, "Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction." And of course, that person is Jesus Christ. He also wrote a magnificent 3-volume series known as the Jesus of Nazareth series, which illustrates this Christocentric principle in spades. How did Pope Benedict XVI contribute to a more Christocentric Catholicism?
Well, in all the ways you just mentioned. And it goes right back to his early formation. A scholasticism that was very rationalistic tended to be non-biblical, and for that same reason tended to be non-Christological. Now, I'm overstating it here to make the point, but there was a tendency to read religion in a very rationalistic, deductive way, and to bracket Christian particularity. Well, the young Ratzinger turns not toward the neo-scholastics, but he turns toward Bonaventure and Augustine and the Fathers, for all of whom the particular Christ, this Logos made flesh, this Jesus, is the point of orientation. Think of so much of theological liberalism, beginning with someone like Schleiermacher, that also bracketed the particularity of Jesus. It was very much in favor of a universal type religious experience. Ratzinger would have been formed against that. Now, the paradox, and he had the nuance of mind to see it. The paradox is the more you emphasize that particular Jesus, who is the Logos made flesh, the more you're able to enter into a conversation with those outside the Christian ambit. So for him, it was not this either or. It was an implication of his Christocentrism that he could be very much geared to the culture. Now, that's Word on Fire. I mean, even as I talk about this, I see in so many ways, I would have read Ratzinger, beginning in the late 80s or 90s, and I used him in my classes at Mundelein for many years. I had the students read the Introduction to Christianity, many others. I just see in all these ways, through a kind of osmosis, Ratzinger's thinking became my thinking on a lot of issues. And I still think it's the best way forward for the church, especially in its dialogue with the modern world. So, are you going to just pay tribute to this massively important figure?
Well, as we close, let me ask you this final question about his enduring legacy. I'm pretty confident that in 100 years, 200 years, people are still going to be reading Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. And when they do, and they look backward on his life and legacy, what one word or phrase or theme do you think people in the future will use to sum up Ratzinger Benedict?
That's good, Brandon. It's difficult to answer because you don't want to be flippant about it. Faith and reason comes to mind, that he's one of the great advocates of faith and reason. But the Christocentric thing is what's really striking me. And the citation you just gave, maybe that's it. Pope Francis has emphasized that many times. Christianity is not an ideology or philosophy. It's a relationship to a person. And then from that central place, the whole of his thought kind of unfolds. So maybe that's it. Maybe it's the friendship with Jesus. That's at the heart of his. It's funny. I think of Karl Barth here, the great Protestant theologian, and Ratzinger's one of his heroes was Balthasar, and Balthasar was very connected to Barth. And Barth was brilliant intellectual, multi-volume work and so on. As an old man, he comes to America, University of Chicago. And he gave a lecture, and then there's a Q&A, and someone said to him, how would you sum up your theology? And he said, I think I'd use a line from a song from your culture. Jesus loves me, this I know, because the Bible tells me so. I thought, pretty good. That is pretty good summary of Barth. And you wouldn't be all that far from Ratzinger in saying that too.
Well, as we wrap up, I want to share with all of our listeners that Word on Fire has built a new website centered around Pope Benedict XVI that features all of Bishop Barron's and Word on Fire's resources on this great man and his thinking. So multiple articles, videos, homilies, podcasts. You can find that at wordonfire.org/Benedict resources. I'll, of course, include a link in the show notes. Also, last year we produced a magnificent book. I'm going to hold it up here so you can see it on the screen. It's called The Pope Benedict XVI Reader, and it's an anthology of Benedict's writing, speeches, teachings, biography that was specifically created for those who haven't read anything of Pope Benedict and want to find an easy way in. Tracy Rowland, the renowned Benedict XVI scholar, says, this is the Ratzinger equivalent of a highlights disc. Within these pages, readers can find his best arias, his most famous overtures, his hauntingly pure, slow movement adagios. These excerpts are an opportunity to access the mind and the heart of the master theologian of our age. Every Catholic home should have a copy of this book. Tracy's words, not mine, but I agree with her. So check it out. You can find it at wordonfire.org/Benedict. And again, I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. Well, thanks all of you for listening and watching this special episode dedicated to Pope Benedict XVI. And we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.